The check was $1,247. He slid it across the table like it was a receipt for coffee. Our 25th anniversary. The restaurant had white tablecloths and a piano playing something sad. I was wearing the blue dress I bought at Macy's 3 years ago. He was wearing the same watch his father gave him. I looked at the bill, then at him. "You handle it," he said. "I've covered enough tonight." The waitress stood there. Her name tag said Rhonda. I smiled at her and pulled out my credit card. Michael turned to talk to his brother on the phone. He laughed about something. I didn't hear what. I was thinking about the receipt in his jacket. The one I found last night when I was looking for his car keys. Hotel Elysian. BAR tab. $89. Signed Claire. I didn't say anything then. I said, "Happy anniversary, Michael." I gave Rhonda my card. She looked at me with that waitress look. I know that look. I've given that look. He was still laughing. That's when I knew someone was lying. And it wasn't me. I found the receipt on a Thursday. He'd been home for 2 days, which was unusual, and I was looking for his keys because he'd promised to pick up our daughter from her shift at the bookstore. He was in the shower. His jacket was draped over the back of the kitchen chair, the same chair he always used. I didn't go through his pockets. I just reached in for the keys and my fingers touched paper. I pulled it out without thinking. Hotel Elysian. $89. BAR tab. Claire. I looked at the date. 3 weeks ago. He was supposed to be in Denver that week. I put it back. I drove to the bookstore and picked up Sophie. I came home and made dinner. I asked him about Denver. He told me about the conference, the hotel, the meetings. He talked for 10 minutes. He never mentioned Claire. That was Thursday. Friday we went to the grocery store together. Saturday we had friends over for dinner. Sunday he worked on his golf swing in the backyard. Monday he left again. Tuesday I sta route looking at bank accounts. Wednesday I found a number. I called it from my office phone. A woman answered and said, "Claire speaking." I hung up. So when he slid that check across the table on Saturday night, I already knew what he was hiding. The question was whether he knew I knew. He didn't. He never would have pushed that bill at me if he did. He was still Michael, still comfortable, still assuming I would just handle it. I signed the credit card receipt. Rhonda smiled at me. I smiled back. Michael ended his call and said, "Everything okay?" I said, "Everything's fine." He said, "You look tired." I said, "I'm just tired." We drove home in silence. He had a glass of scotch in the living room. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of our bed. I could hear him downstairs, the ice clinking against the glass. He never came up. He fell asleep on the couch eventually. That was how he handled a rise. That was how he handled most things. I stayed awake. I pulled out my phone and opened Venmo. I typed his name. $1,247. In the memo box I typed, "For the anniversary dinner." And a conversation about Claire. My thumb hovered. I didn't press send. I fell asleep around 3. He was already gone when I woke up. A note on the kitchen counter. "Work. Back late. Don't wait up." He never signed it. He never signed anything. I made coffee. I sat at the same table, the same chair. His jacket was gone. I looked at the note again. "Don't wait up." Like it was a kindness. Like he was doing me a favor by letting me off the hook of his company. Sophie came down around 9. She was wearing her bookstore apron. "Mom, you okay?" I said, "I'm fine. Just tired." She looked at me the way daughters do when they're trying to decide if they need to worry. I told her I was fine. She left for work. I sat there for an hour. I watched the morning sun move across the kitchen floor. I thought about 19 years. I thought about the blue dress I'd bought at Macy's. I thought about the check and the receipt and the woman named Claire. I thought about Michael sliding that bill across the table like I was his accountant, like I was the one he paid. I pulled out my phone again. I looked at the Venmo request. I read at the memo. And a conversation about Claire. I pressed send. I put the phone on the table. I finished my coffee. I looked out the window. The neighbor's dog was barking. A car drove past. Nothing happened. For a full minute, nothing happened. I almost thought he hadn't seen it. I almost thought he was still asleep on the couch somewhere, Still not coming up the stairs. Then my phone buzzed. He didn't call. He texted. What is this? 4 words. No period. I typed back. You know what it is. He typed something. Erased it. Typed something else. I watched the little dots appear and disappear. They stayed gone for a long time. Then my phone rang. I picked up. He didn't say hello. He said, what are you talking about? I said, I found the receipt. Silence. I could hear him breathing. I could hear a car horn in the background. He was already on the road. He said, what receipt? I said, the hotel receipt. The BAR tab. The one signed by Claire. He said, you went through my jacket? I said, I was looking for your keys. You were going to pick up Sophie. He said, that's not. Then he stopped. I said, Michael. He said, let me explain. I said, you can explain when you get home. I hung up. I walked through the house. Our house. The one we'd bought when Sophie was 3. The one with the broken drawer in the kitchen and the crack in the driveway and the den I'd planted. I looked at everything. I touched the counter. I touched the refrigerator. I thought about what I was going to do. I wasn't sad yet. I was still too angry for sad. The anger was cold, clinical. It was the same feeling I got when a client changed a brief on me 3 times in 1 week. It wasn't hot. It was just clear. I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I called Marga Retchan. She answered on the first ring. I told her I needed to see her as soon as possible. She said tomorrow morning at 11. I said okay. She said, Elena, is everything all right? I said no. But it will be. I went to my office. I logged into our joint accounts. I sta route taking screenshots. I made a list. I didn't cry. Crying would have been a luxury I couldn't afford right then. Crying was for people who didn't know what was coming. He showed up at 6 that evening. The car door slammed. The front door opened. He didn't call out. He just walked in. I was in the kitchen, king. Chicken. Rice. Vegetables. The same dinner I'd made 100 times. I was wearing the same apron. He stood in the doorway. He looked like he'd been driving fast. He looked like he'd rehearsed something on the way home. Elena. I turned. I kept my hand on the spatula. Dinner's almost ready. He said, we need to talk. I said, dinner first. He said, I'm not hungry. I said, Sophie's coming home in an hour. We're going to eat dinner. You're going to sit at this table with your family. Then we'll talk. He didn't argue. He sat down. He didn't help me set the table. He just sat there, looking at his hands. Sophie came home. She talked about her shift, about a customer who'd ordered something she'd never heard of, about a friend who was going to community college. I asked questions. Michael said nothing. Sophie noticed. Dad, you okay? He said, fine. Just tired. She looked at me. I shrugged. She let it go. After dinner, Sophie went upstairs. I did the dishes. Michael sat at the table. He watched me. I could feel his eyes on my back. I turned off the water. I dried my hands. I sat across from him. He said, it's not what you think. I said, you don't know what I think. He said, I can explain. Just let me explain. I said, I'm listening. He said, it's over. It was never, she's nothing. I don't know why he stopped. He rubbed his face. I said, her name is Claire. He said, yes. I said, she's 52. She's a real estate agent. You met her in Chicago at a conference. You've been seeing her for 8 months. He looked at me. How do you? I said, you don't think I know how to use the internet, Michael. He read at me. I'm sorry. I said, I know you're sorry. You're sorry you got caught. He said, that's not true. I said, it doesn't matter if it's true. What matters is that you looked at me across that table in the restaurant and you pushed me a check. You told me I've covered enough. You treated me like a goddamn employee. In front of Rhonda. In front of everyone. He said, I didn't mean. I said, you meant exactly what you said. You just didn't mean for me to already know what I knew. I looked at him. I found that receipt before we went to the restaurant. I found it Thursday. You know what I did Thursday? He shook his head. I said, I picked up Sophie. I made dinner. I asked you about Denver. You sat right where you're sitting now and told me about the conference. You never mentioned Claire. You never mentioned the BAR tab. You never mentioned the $89. You just sat there and lied to my face. And then you took me out to dinner and handed me a $1,247 check. He was quiet. He didn't have an answer. I said, I'm going to ask you one question. And you're going to tell me the truth. This is the only chance you're going to get. He nodded. I said, do you love her? He opened his mouth. He didn't say anything. Then he said, I don't know. I said, that's all I needed to hear. I stood up. I walked to the living room. I sat in my chair. I heard him sit at the table. I heard the clock on the mantel. I heard our daughter moving around upstairs. I heard everything. He didn't follow me. I drove to Margaret's office the next morning with a folder full of screenshots. Her building was in an older part of town, brick and ivy, a brass plaque next to the door. I'd never been to a lawyer before. I'd never needed one. I sat in her waiting room and looked at the framed degrees on the wall and tried to remember how to breathe. Margaret came out and shook my hand. She was maybe 60, gray hair cut short, glasses on a chain. She didn't smile like she was trying to put me at ease. She smiled like she already knew what I was going to say. She led me into her office and closed the door. She said, tell me what's going on. I opened the folder. I told her about the receipt. I told her about the check. I told her about Claire and the phone call and the Venmo request. I told her about his face when I asked if he loved her. I didn't cry. I'd stopped even feeling like I might. She listened. She took notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. She said, you have more power than you think. The question is whether you'll use it. I said, I'm here, aren't I? She nodded. She pulled out a form. She said, I need you to be very clear with me. Are you considering divorce or are you just gathering information? I said, I don't know yet. She said, then let's gather information. What do you know about your finances? I told her I knew what was in the checking and savings. I told her about the retirement accounts and the mortgage and the CAR payments. I told her about my business income, which I'd always treated as supplemental, which I'd always let him handle the bigger picture of. She asked, do you know what's in the investment accounts? I said, he handles those. He's always handled those. She wrote something down. I need you to get me statements. Every account. Every number. His pension, his 401k, any life insurance policies, any credit cards. I need you to find out exactly what you have. I said, he won't give me access. She said, you don't ask. You look. His office. His desk. The filing cabinet in the garage. You find what you can and you take pictures. If he notices you're looking, you tell him you're doing taxes. I said, he'll know I'm lying. She said, he already knows you know about Claire. He's not going to be thinking about the investments. He's going to be thinking about how to talk his way out of it. Use that. I drove home with my head full of numbers. I parked in the garage. I sat in the car for a minute. Michael was at work. Sophie was at school. The house was empty. I didn't start with the filing cabinet. I started with his office. His office was in the basement. He had a big oak desk, leather chair, a bookshelf full of binders. I'd been down there maybe a dozen times in 19 years. It was his space. I didn't go in without knocking. I went in without knocking. I opened the desk drawers first. Pens, paper clips, old receipts. I found his checkbook in the bottom drawer. I took a picture of every page. I found a folder marked investments. I took it upstairs. I spread it out on the kitchen table. Mutual funds. 2 401k accounts. An IRA. A brokerage account I didn't even know existed. I looked at the balances. I looked at the joint accounts, the ones with my name on them. Then I looked at the accounts that were just his. There was a third account. I'd never seen it before. It was an online savings account, separate from everything else. The balance was a little over $17,000 Rs. I looked at the transactions. They went back 2 years. He'd been moving money out of our joint account and into this one, a few $100s at a time. Not enough to notice. Just enough to build. I read at it. I wasn't hurt. I was impressed. He'd been planning something. Maybe not divorce. Maybe just a safety net. Maybe he'd been preparing for this long before Claire. I took pictures of everything. I put it all back. I went upstairs and sat in the living room. I thought about $17,000 RS. I thought about the check he'd pushed across the table. I thought about 19 RS of groceries and school supplies and piano lessons. I thought about the work I'd done at night, in this house, in this living room, while he sat in his basement office. He came home at 6. He had flowers in his hand. Grocery store flowers, the kind in plastic wrap. He held them out like they were an apology. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Elena, I'm sorry. I want to fix this." I said, "Sit down." He sat. He put the flowers on the table. "I left them there." He said, "I haven't been myself. I've been stressed. The job, the travel. I made a mistake. I'm not going to make excuses." I said, "You already made excuses. You said you were stressed." He said, "I know. I'm not going to do that. I want to go to counseling. I want to work on us. I want you to know that I'm committed." I said, "You were committed to her for 8 months." He said, "It's over. It's been over. I ended it before the anniversary dinner." I said, "Then why did you push me the check?" He said, "I don't know. I was angry. I don't know why." I said, "You were angry because you felt guilty. You pushed the check to me because you wanted to feel like you were in control. You wanted to make yourself feel better by making me smaller." He said, "That's not true." I said, "It is true. You've been making me smaller for 19 years. You just didn't know I noticed." He said, "That's not fair. I've supported this family. I've worked for everything we have." I said, "And you think I haven't?" He said, "That's not what I said. I said, Michael, I have 2 degrees. I have a successful business. I have been the prima repa rent for our daughter for 18 years. I have managed this house, these meals, these holidays, these family functions. I have paid for things. I have contributed. And you have never once treated me like an equal. You've treated me like an employee. And you pushed me a check to prove it." He was quiet. He looked at the table. He said, "I don't know what you want me to say." I said, "I don't want you to say anything. I want you to go to work tomorrow. I want you to think about what you've done. And I want you to think about what you're going to do next." I picked up the flowers. I walked to the sink. I put them in a vase. I filled it with water. I set it on the counter. He said, "Is that it?" I said, "That's it for tonight." He didn't argue. He went down to his office. I heard the basement door close. I sat in the living room with a cup of tea and thought about $17,000 RS. I thought about Claire. I thought about the attorney's office. I thought about what Marga Red had said. Use it. I didn't know what that meant yet. But I knew I was going to find out. I spent the next 3 days collecting. I went to the bank. I opened a new account in my name only. I had the teller transfer a portion of the joint savings into it. Not all of it. Just enough to make a point. I signed papers. I tucked the debit card in my wallet. I called Sophie. I asked her to come home for the weekend. She said she had plans. I said it was important. She said okay. She came home Friday night. Michael was in his office. I was in the kitchen. I made her dinner. I waited until she finished eating. I said, "Your father and I are having some difficulties." She said, "I know." I said, "You know." She said, "Mom, I'm not stupid. I see things. I heard you on the phone. I've heard him on the phone. I know about Claire." I said, "How long have you known?" She said, "A few months." I didn't want to say anything. I didn't know what to say. I said, "You should have told me." She said, "I didn't want to hurt you." I said, "Sweet ART, the hurt already happened. You just didn't know when to look for it." She sta root to cry. I didn't. I couldn't. I put my hand on hers. I said, "I'm going to be fine. And you're going to be fine. But you need to know that I'm not going to pretend anymore. I'm not going to make this look okay for anyone." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to take care of things. I'm going to take care of us." She wanted to talk to her father. I told her to wait. I told her there would be a time for that. She went upstairs. I heard her door close. Michael came up from the basement. He looked at me. He said, "Is she okay?" I said, "She knows." He said, "She knows." I said, "She's known for months. She just didn't want to tell me." He said, "Jesus." I said, that's what I said. He walked into the living room. He sat down. He put his head in his hands. I stayed in the kitchen. I put the dishes away. I wiped the counter. I turned off the light. I walked past him. I didn't say anything. I went to our bedroom. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at my phone. There was a text from Marga read, "Any progress?" I typed back. I found an account. 17,000. Transfers over to IRS. She replied, "Take pictures. I'm proud of you." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed and listened to the house settle. I heard Sophie move in her room. I heard Michael on the couch. I heard the furnace kick on. I heard everything. I thought about the check. I thought about the restaurant. I thought about Rhonda and the blue dress and the piano playing something sad. I thought about the hotel bar tab. I thought about Claire. I thought about what she looked like. I thought about what they did together. I thought about whether she knew about me. I thought about the $17,000 RS. I thought about how long he'd been planning. I thought about how long I'd been not looking. I made a decision. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew I was moving toward it. I could feel it in my chest. Something was building. Something was coming. The next morning, I woke up early. I went to the kitchen. Michael was on the couch. He was still asleep. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I opened my phone. I opened Venmo. I looked at the request I'd sent. He hadn't accepted it. He hadn't declined it. It was just sitting there unaddressed. I sent another one. $500. Memo, for the hotel room. I found the receipt. I waited. My phone buzzed. He accepted the first request. The second one was still pending. He walked into the kitchen. He was wearing the same clothes from yesterday. He looked terrible. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm making coffee." He said, "The Venmo requests." I said, "You asked what I was doing." "I'm making coffee." He said, "You're making a point." I said, "I'm making a point. And you're going to accept the second one." He said, "We need to talk." I said, "I've been talking. You've been lying." He said, "I'm not lying anymore." I said, "Prove it." He said, "How?" I said, "Accept the request." He pulled out his phone. He accepted it. My phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. $500. I smiled. He said, "Are you happy now?" I said, "I'm not happy. But I'm going to be." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I'm going to walk out that door. I'm going to go to my office. I'm going to work. I'm going to earn money. And I'm going to decide what happens next. Not you. Not Claire. Me." He said, "You're talking like you've already made up your mind." I said, "I haven't made up my mind about everything. But I've made up my mind about one thing. I'm not going to live the rest of my life being the one who handles the check." I put my coffee cup in the sink. I grabbed my bag. I walked to the door. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "To work. I'll be back tonight." He said, "Elena." I turned around. He said, "I love you." I said, "I don't think you know what that means." I walked out. I didn't look back. I spent the morning at my desk. I had 3 client projects due by Friday. Brand guidelines for a coffee roaster. A logo refresh for a pediatric dentist. A website mock-up for a nonprofit that helped women re-enter the workforce. I worked on all of them. I moved shapes around. I chose colors. I met my deadlines. I was good at my job. I always had been. He just never saw it that way. At noon, I drove to the bank. I sat with a personal banker named Diane. She had kind eyes and a nameplate on her desk. I told her I wanted to open a business account. I told her I wanted to transfer my client payments out of the joint account. She nodded. She asked questions. She didn't pry. I signed forms. I walked out with a new routing number and a feeling I hadn't had in years. I called Marga Rhett from the parking lot. I told her I'd found the account. I told her I'd opened my own. She said, "Good. Keep going." I went back to work. I emailed my clients. I updated my payment instructions. I wrote a spreadsheet. I listed every asset I knew about. I listed every debt. I listed every monthly expense. I wanted to see it all in one place. I wanted to know exactly what I was standing on. Michael called at 4. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 5. I answered. He said, "Where are you?" I said, "Still at work." He said, "You're never at work this late." I said, "I'm never at work at all, apparently." That's part of the problem. He said, "I didn't say that." I said, "You didn't have to. You showed me." He was quiet. He said, "Are you coming home?" I said, "I'll be home for dinner." He said, "I'm making dinner." I said, "You don't see Kay." He said, "I'm learning." I hung up. I sat there for a minute. I thought about him in the kitchen. I thought about the last time he'd made dinner. I couldn't remember. I thought about the flowers. I thought about the Venmo requests. I thought about the $17,000 RS. I drove home. I pulled into the driveway. The kitchen light was on. I could see him through the window. He was standing at the stove. He was holding a spatula. He looked like he was at a conference. He looked like he was doing a presentation. I walked in. He had pasta on the stove. He had a salad in a bowl. He had wine poured. He looked proud of himself. He said, "I wanted to do something nice." I said, "It's pasta." He said, "I know it's pasta. But I made it." I sat down. He served me. He sat across from me. He watched me take a bite. I said, "It's good." He said, "Thank you." We ate in silence. I could feel him wanting to talk. I could feel him waiting. I didn't give him anything. He said, "I've been thinking." I said, "About what?" He said, "About what you said. About how I made you smaller." I didn't see it that way. But I'm rooting too. I said, rooting too. He said, "I'm trying." I said, "Trying is not doing." He said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "I want you to tell me the truth. I want you to tell me everything. I want you to sit there and not sugarcoat it. I want you to tell me about Claire. I want you to tell me about the money. I want you to tell me why you thought you could do this and I wouldn't leave." He said, "I thought you'd be afraid." I said, "Afraid of what?" He said, "Afraid of being alone. Afraid of rooting over." I said, "Why would I be afraid of that?" He said, "Because you've never been alone. You've always had me. You've always had the house. You've always had the security." I said, "You think you're my security?" He said, "I think you've depended on me." I said, "Michael, I've depended on myself. I've just let you think you were the one doing it." He said, "That's not fair." I said, "I don't see what's fair. I see about what's true." He put down his fork. He said, "Fine. You want the truth? The truth is I didn't think you'd leave. I thought you'd forgive me. I thought you'd be angry, but then you'd get over it. Because that's what you always do. You get over things. You handle things. I thought I could do this, and you would just absorb it." I said, "And now," he said, "I don't think you're going to absorb this." I said, "You're right. I'm not." He said, "So what are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know yet. But I'll tell you one thing. I'm not going to handle this. I'm not going to be the one who smooths everything over. I'm not going to be the one who makes it easy for you. You did this. You get to sit in it." He said, "I'm sitting in it." I said, "Good. Keep sitting." I got up. I took my plate to the sink. I said, "The pasta was good. Thank you for making it." I went to the bedroom. I closed the door. I sat on the bed and looked at my phone. Margaret had sent me a list. Things to do. Documents to request. Steps to take. Root reading. Root taking notes. Sophie came home at 9. She knocked on my door. I said, "Come in." She sat on the bed. She looked at me. She said, "Did you guys have a fight?" I said, "No. We had a conversation." She said, "That's not what it sounded like." I said, "What did it sound like?" She said, "It sounded like you were leaving." I said, "I'm not leaving. Not yet. But I'm not staying the way I was." She said, "Mom, I don't want you to stay if you're unhappy." I said, "I know, sweetheart. I don't want to stay if I'm unhappy either." She hugged me. She said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." I said, "I know. That's why I'm not afraid." She went to her room. I sat there for a long time. I thought about what Michael had said. He thought I'd be afraid. He thought I couldn't do it alone. He thought I'd stay because I had to. He had no idea who I was. The next morning, I called Claire. I'd found her number in Michael's phone. I'd copied it while he was in the shower. I didn't plan what I was going to say. I just dialed. She answered. Hello, I said. Claire, she said. Who is this? I said. My name is Elena. Michael's wife. Silence. Then she said, oh. I said, I'm not calling to scream at you. I want to ask you something. She said, I don't think I should talk to you. I said, you can hang up. But you should know I'm going to ask anyway. She said, what do you want to know? I said, did you know about me? She said, yes. I said, and you were okay with that? She said, I wasn't okay with it. But I didn't stop it. I said, why? She said, because I was lonely. Because he listened. Because he made me feel like I mattered. I said, he made me feel like I didn't. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I don't want your apology. I want to understand. She said, understand what? I said, understand what he told you. Understand what you thought you were getting. She said, he told me things were difficult at home. He told me you had grown apart. He told me you were more like roommates than a couple. I said, and you believed him? She said, I wanted to. I said, I get that. She said, you do? I said, I know what it's like to want to believe something. I've been doing it for 19 years. She said, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything. I said, it doesn't. But I don't hate you. She said, you don't? I said, no. I hate him. But I don't hate you. She was quiet. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to figure it out. I just wanted you to know that he told me the same things he told you. He told me he was stressed. He told me he wasn't himself. He told me he wanted to fix it. He told me you didn't mean anything. She said, he told me that you didn't see a re. I laughed. It came out of me like a cough. I said, he told me you were nothing. He told me you were a mistake. She said, he told me I was the best thing that happened to him. I said, he told me the same thing once. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, you know what? I said, what? She said, I'm not going to see him again. I said, that's your decision. She said, he's been calling me, texting me. He told me you found out. He told me you were going to leave him. He told me he wanted to be with me. I said, and you believed him? She said, not anymore. I said, good. She said, I don't know why I'm telling you this. I said, because you're not a bad person. You're just a person who made a mistake. Like me. She said, thank you. I said, you don't have to thank me. Just do what you need to do. I hung up. I sat there. I felt something shift. I didn't know what it was. But I felt it. Michael came home at noon. He said he took the day off. He said he wanted to be with me. I sat in the living room. He sat across from me. He said, I talked to Claire today. I said, I know. I talked to her too. He said, you what? I said, I called her. We had a conversation. He said, what did she say? I said, she said you told her you wanted to be with her. She said you told her you were going to leave me. He said, that's not true. I said, it's exactly what she said. He said, she's lying. I said, she's not lying. You're lying. You're still lying. Even now. Even after everything. You're sitting there and you're still lying to me. He said, Elena, I'm not. I said, Michael, enough is enough. He stopped. He looked at me. He looked like he'd been slapped. I said, I am going to ask you one more time. And if you lie to me, I'm going to walk out that door and I'm not coming back. Do you understand? He nodded. I said, did you tell Claire you were going to leave me? He was quiet. He looked at the floor. He said, yes. I said, thank you. That's the first honest thing you've said in 3 days. I stood up. I walked to the door. He said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to walk. I'm going to think. I'm going to decide what happens next. I left. I walked to the corner. I walked to the park. I sat on a bench. I watched people. I thought about 19 years. I thought about Claire. I thought about Michael. I thought about the $17,000 RS. I thought about what Claire had said. He told me I was the best thing that happened to him. He told me that once. He told me I was everything. He looked me in the eye and said I was the most important person in his life. I didn't believe him anymore. I didn't believe anything he said. But I believed something else. I believed I was going to be okay. I believed I was going to figure it out. I believed I was stronger than he thought. I believed I was stronger than I thought. I walked home. I opened the front door. Michael was sitting on the couch. He had his head in his hands. I walked past him. I walked to the bedroom. I closed the door. I took out my phone. I opened Venmo. I sent him another request. $17,000. Memo, for the account you didn't tell me about. I waited. My phone buzzed. He declined. I smiled. I typed, I know you saw it. I'll give you until tomorrow. I put the phone down. I lay on the bed. I closed my eyes. I heard the basement door close. I heard him go down to his office. I heard everything. He didn't come up that night. I heard him moving around downstairs, the creak of his office chair, the low murmur of his voice on the phone. I didn't try to listen. I didn't see what he was saying. I knew he was red. I knew he was trying to figure out what to do. I knew he had no idea what was coming. I slept through the night. No dreams. No waking up. I woke up with the sun and I felt rested. I hadn't felt rested in months. I sat up and looked at the window. The light was coming through the blinds. I heard birds outside. I heard the neighbor's dog barking. I heard Sophie in the shower. I got up. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I opened my phone. The Venmo request was still pending. He hadn't accepted it. He hadn't declined it again. He was stalling. I drank my coffee. I looked at the clock. 7:30. He was still in the basement. I didn't call him up. I let him sit down there. I let him stew. Sophie came down. She looked at me. She said, "You're up, EAROY." I said, "I couldn't sleep." She said, "Is Dad okay?" I said, "I don't know. You should ask him." She said, "I don't want to get involved." I said, "Sweetheart, you're already involved. You live here. You're part of this family." She said, "I just want to stay out of it." I said, "You can. But you should know that whatever happens, it's not your fault. It's not about you. It's about me and your father." She said, "I know." I said, "Good." She poured herself cereal. She sat across from me. She said, "Are you going to leave him?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "If you do, I'll come with you." I said, "I know you will. But I don't want you to have to choose." She said, "I'm not choosing. I'm just saying I'll be wherever you are." I reached across the table. I squeezed her hand. I said, "Thank you." She went to work. I sat there. I finished my coffee. I looked at the basement door. I heard him moving around down there. I heard him open a drawer. I heard him close it. I went to the door. I opened it. I said, "Michael, come up here." He came up. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like he'd been crying. He said, "Elena, I need to talk to you." I said, "I know. That's why I called you up." We sat at the table. He looked at the counter. He said, "I've been thinking." I said, "About what?" He said, "About what you said. About how I made you smaller. About how I never treated you like an equal. About the money." I said, "The money." He said, "The 17,000. I know you saw it." I said, "I saw it." He said, "I was going to use it to start over. Not with her. Just start over." I didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew I needed something. I said, "You needed something. So you took it." He said, "It was mine." I said, "It was ours." He said, "I net it." I said, "I net it too. Every time I stayed home with Sophie. Every time I worked at night. Every time I made dinner and did laundry and made sure this house ran. That was work. That was earning. And you took that money and you put it away like I didn't exist." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I don't want your apology. I want the money back." He said, "It's already gone." I said, "What do you mean it's gone?" He said, "I transferred it to an account with my name on it. It's not in the joint account anymore." I said, "Michael, that money was in our joint account. That money was half mine. You can't just take it." He said, "I already did." I said, "Then you're going to have to find a way to put it back." He said, "I can't. I don't have it." I said, you don't have $17,000 RS, he said. I spent some of it. On hotels. On dinners. On Claire. I said, you spent our money on Claire. He said, I didn't think of it as our money. I said, of course you didn't. You never did. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I leaned against the counter. I looked at him. I said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to find a way to replace that money. You're going to take it out of your pension if you have to. You're going to sell something. You're going to figure it out. And you're going to put it back into the joint account. And then we're going to talk about what happens next. He said, and if I don't, I said, then I call Marga Ret Chan. And I file for divorce. And I ask for half of everything, including the money you've already spent. And I get it. He said, you can't do that. I said, I can. And I will. He was quiet. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He said, I'll figure it out. I said, good. He went back down to the basement. I stood in the kitchen. I felt my heart beating. I felt my hands shaking. I didn't know where that had come from. I didn't know I could say those things. But I had. And I meant them. I called Marga Ret. I told her what had happened. She said, you did the right thing. Now we need to prepare for the worst. I said, I know. She said, he's going to try to hide more. He's going to try to move money around. You need to monitor everything. Get copies of every statement. Track every transaction. Don't let him get away with anything. I said, I won't. She said, and Elena, you need to think about what you want. Not what you think you should want. What you actually want. I said, I'm trying. She said, good. Call me if anything happens. I hung up. I sat in the living room. I looked at the walls. I looked at the pictures. I looked at the wedding photo on the mantle. He was holding me. We were smiling. We were young. We thought we knew what we were doing. I took the photo down. I put it in a drawer. I didn't throw it away. I just put it somewhere I couldn't see it. The next few days were quiet. Michael went to work. He came home. He didn't talk about Claire. He didn't talk about the money. He didn't talk about anything. He moved through the house like a ghost. I moved through it like I was alone. I went in my office. I worked on my projects. I finished the coffee roaster branding. I sent the pediatric dentist the final files. I finished the website mock-up for the nonprofit. I invoiced them. I got paid. I transferred the money to my new account. I watched the balance grow. It wasn't a lot. But it was mine. On Thursday, Michael came home with a check. He put it on the kitchen counter. He said, I cashed out some investments. It's $17,000 RS. It's all there. I said, thank you. He said, is that it? I said, what do you mean? He said, I gave you the money. Are we done? I said, we're not done. We're not done until I decide we're done. He said, what else do you want from me? I said, I want you to understand what you did. I want you to sit with it. I want you to think about it. And then I want you to tell me why I should stay. He said, I don't know what to say. I said, then think about it. And when you figure it out, come find me. I took the check. I deposited it in the joint account. I left his copy on the counter. I went in my office and I closed the door. I sat at my desk. I opened my computer. I wrote a new folder. I labeled it, Assets. I put in every statement I had. I made a list of every account. I added the house. I added the CARS. I added the investments. I added the pension. I added everything. I looked at the total. It was more than I thought. It was more than enough. I called Marga Ret. I told her the money was back. She said, good. Now we have to protect it. She told me to open a separate account for the house. She told me to take my name off the joint credit cards. She told me to start a document that tracked every interaction with Michael. She told me to be ready. I did everything she said. I did it all in a day. I drove to the bank. I opened another account. I transferred the house money. I closed the joint credit cards. I applied for my own. I wrote the document. I wrote down every conversation. I wrote down every detail. I felt like I was preparing for a war. Because I was. Friday night, Sophie came home. She said she wanted to have dinner with both of us. She said she wanted to talk. We sat at the table. Michael and I on opposite sides. Sophie at the head. She looked at both of us. She said, I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's going on. I said, okay. She said, Dad, you had an affair. He said, I know. She said, and Mom, you're trying to decide what to do. I said, I'm doing more than trying. She said, I know. But I need to say something. We waited. She said, I've been thinking about this for days. And I've decided that I'm not going to choose sides. I love both of you. But I need both of you to know that I'm not going to be a pawn. I'm not going to be the reason either of you stays or goes. Michael said, we wouldn't. She said, you would. You already are. You're both acting like I'm the prize. Like whoever I go with wins. But I'm not a prize. I'm your daughter. And I'm going to be okay no matter what happens. But I need you to be okay too. Without me being the reason. I said, Sophie, we never meant to put you in the middle. She said, I know. But you did. So now I'm telling you to stop. I looked at Michael. He looked at me. We both looked at our daughter. She said, figure out what you want. Figure it out without me. And then tell me what's going to happen. But don't use me to hurt each other. I said, I won't. Michael said, I won't. She nodded. She said, good. Now can we please have dinner? We ate. We talked about normal things. We talked about her classes and her friends and her plans for the summer. We talked like a family. It felt strange. It felt like a performance. After dinner, Sophie went to her room. Michael and I stood in the kitchen. He said, I didn't think she'd say that. I said, neither did I. He said, she's stronger than us. I said, she always has been. He said, what are we going to do? I said, I don't know. But we're going to figure it out. Without using her. He nodded. He went down to the basement. I went to the bedroom. I sat on the bed. I looked at my phone. There was a text from Marga read, have you made a decision yet? I typed back. Not yet. But I'm getting closer. She said, take your time. But not too much time. I put the phone down. I lay on the bed. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about what Sophie had said. I thought about how she'd stood up to both of us. I thought about how she'd refused to be a pawn. I thought about how she'd forced us to face our own choices. I thought about Michael. I thought about the $17,000 RS. I thought about Claire. I thought about the check. I thought about everything. I thought about what I wanted. I didn't know yet. But I knew I was going to find out. The weekend passed in a kind of suspended silence. Michael stayed in the basement. I stayed in the living room. Sophie stayed in her room. We moved around each other like we were all strangers sharing a house. We ate meals together, but we didn't talk. We watched television, but we didn't see it. We were waiting for something. I just didn't know what. Monday morning I woke up and I knew. I didn't know how I knew. I just knew. I sat up in bed and I looked at the window and I said out loud, I'm not staying. I said it to the room. I said it to the walls. I said it to the furniture. I said it to the dresser and the mirror and the lamp on the nightstand. I said it to the morning light coming through the blinds. I'm not staying. I got up. I showered. I put on clothes. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I waited. Michael came up at 8. He looked at me. He said, you have that look. I said, what look? He said, the look you had at the restaurant. The one you had when you pushed the check back. I said, I didn't push it back. I paid it. He said, you know what I mean. I said, I know. He sat across from me. He didn't have coffee. He just sat. He said, what are you thinking? I said, I'm thinking I want a divorce. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. He just sat there. He said, I thought you might say that. I said, did you? He said, I've been watching you. You've been preparing. You've been getting ready. I could see it happening. I said, then you know I'm not going to change my mind. He said, I know. We sat there. The clock on the wall ticked. The refrigerator hummed. I heard our drive past outside. I heard the neighbor's dog. He said, I don't want a divorce. I said, I know you don't. He said, I love you. I still love you. I know you don't believe me. But I do. I said, I believe you love me. I just don't think you know how. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means you love me like a house. Like a couch. Like a car. You love me because I'm there. You love me because I'm useful. You love me because I handle things. He said, that's not true. I said, it is true. And I'm tired of being a thing you love. I want to be someone you choose. He said, I'm choosing you now. I said, you're choosing me because I'm leaving. That's not a choice. That's a panic. He said, so what do I do? I said, I don't know. But it's not my problem anymore. I stood up. I walked to the bedroom. I sta route packing. He followed me. He stood in the doorway. He watched me put clothes in a suitcase. He said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to stay with Sophie for a few days. Then I'm going to find my own place. He said, you're leaving the house. I said, I'm leaving you. The house is just a house. He said, Elena, please. Don't do this. I said, Michael, I'm already gone. I've been gone for weeks. You just didn't want to see it. I zipped the suitcase. I walked past him. I went to the living room. I called Sophie. She answered on the first ring. I said, I'm coming to stay with you for a few days. She said, okay. I said, I'll explain everything when I get there. She said, I'll be here. I hung up. I grabbed my keys. I walked to the front door. Michael was standing in the hallway. He said, is there anything I can say to make you stay? I said, I don't think so. He said, what about the house? What about Sophie? What about everything we built? I said, I built it too. And I'm taking my half. He said, you're going to destroy everything. I said, I'm not destroying anything. I'm just not pretending anymore. I opened the door. I walked out. I didn't look back. I drove to Sophie's apartment. It was small and messy and smelled like candles. She was waiting for me on the front steps. She stood up when I pulled in. She walked over to the car. She didn't say anything. She just hugged me. I held on to her for a long time. I didn't cry. I still couldn't cry. But I held her like she was the only thing keeping me upright. We went inside. She made tea. We sat on her couch. She said, you really did it. I said, I really did it. She said, how do you feel? I said, like I'm breathing for the first time in 19 years. She smiled. She said, that's good, Mom. That's really good. I stayed with Sophie for 3 days. She went to work. I worked from her kitchen table. I answered emails. I talked to clients. I transferred money. I called Margaret. I told her I'd made a decision. She said, good. Now, let's make it official. I filed for divorce on Thursday. I didn't tell Michael. I let the papers show up at the house. I let him find out that way. I knew it was cruel. I knew it was cold. I didn't see Ari. He called me at 6 that evening. He was angry. He said, you filed. I said, I filed. He said, you didn't even tell me. I said, you didn't tell me about Claire. He said, that's not the same thing. I said, it's exactly the same thing. You made a decision without me. I made a decision without you. Now we're even. He said, this is going to ruin us. I said, we were already ruined. You just didn't notice. He hung up. I put the phone down. I sat on Sophie's couch. I looked at the window. The sun was going down. The sky was orange and pink. It was beautiful. Sophie came home. She said, was that Dad? I said, yeah. She said, how did it go? I said, about how you'd expect. She said, are you okay? I said, I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. She said, I know you are. I sta route looking for an apartment the next day. I found one in a neighborhood I'd always liked. 2 bedrooms. Roadwood floors. A balcony that faced the street. It was small. It was nothing like the house. It was perfect. I signed the lease on Saturday. I moved in the next weekend. Sophie helped. She brought boxes. She brought pizza. She brought a plant. She said, every new place needs a plant. I put it on the windowsill. I looked at it. I looked at the empty rooms. I looked at the balcony. I looked at the street below. I said, this is my life now. Sophie said, this is your life now. I said, I don't know what to do with it. She said, you'll figure it out. You always do. She left. I sat on the floor. I sat in the middle of the living room with nothing but boxes and a plant. I sat there for a long time. I thought about Michael. I thought about the house. I thought about the check. I thought about Claire. I thought about the blue dress I'd bought at Macy's. I'd left it in the closet. I didn't want it anymore. I got up. I unpacked my kitchen first. Then my bedroom. Then my office. I set up my desk. I hung my calendar. I put my laptop on the table. I plugged in my phone. I made it mine. I called Margaret the next morning. I said, I'm ready to talk about the rest of it. She said, the rest of what I said, the money, the house, the settlement. I want to know what I'm entitled to. She said, I'll send you the numbers. She did. I looked at them. I looked at what I was owed. I looked at what I had earned. I looked at what I had contributed. It was more than I thought. It was more than enough. I emailed her back. I said, I want a START negotiations. She said, I'll set it up. 2 days later, I got a letter from Michael's attorney. He wanted mediation. He wanted to avoid court. He wanted to talk. I told Margaret one was willing to talk. I told her I had conditions. We set a date. For weeks out. We'd meet in a conference room. We'd sit across from each other. We'd talk about money. We'd talk about assets. We'd talk about the future. I had 4 weeks to get ready. I spent them working. I spent them packing. I spent them making lists. I spent them thinking. I thought about what I wanted. I thought about what I deserved. I thought about what I was willing to fight for. I thought about what I was willing to let go. I thought about Michael. I thought about the person he used to be. I thought about the person he'd become. I thought about whether I still recognized him. I didn't. I didn't recognize him at all. I called Sophie. I told her about the mediation. She said, Are you nervous? I said, I'm not nervous. I'm angry. She said, That's good. Angry is good. I said, Is it? She said, It means you see a re. It means you're not done yet. I said, I'm not done. She said, I know. I hung up. I looked at my apartment. I looked at the plant. I looked at the boxes I'd unpacked. I looked at the life I was building. It wasn't much yet. But it was mine. I thought about Michael. I thought about the check. I thought about the restaurant. I thought about the blue dress. I thought about the piano playing something sad. I thought about Rhonda's name tag. I thought about everything. I thought about Claire. I thought about what she'd said. I was lonely. I understood lonely. I'd been lonely for years. I just hadn't admitted it. I wasn't lonely anymore. I was alone. But I wasn't lonely. There was a difference. I went to sleep that night and I didn't dream. I woke up the next morning and I felt ready. I felt like I could do this. I felt like I could do anything. The mediation date was 2 weeks away. I had 2 weeks to prepare. I had 2 weeks to decide exactly what I was going to ask for. I had 2 weeks to decide exactly what I was willing to give up. I had 2 weeks to make sure I was ready. I spent those 2 weeks doing everything Margaret told me to do. I gathered documents. I made copies. I wrote down questions. I practiced what I was going to say. I practiced not crying. I practiced not yelling. I practiced being calm. I practiced being strong. I was ready. I knew I was ready. I just didn't know if he was. The mediation room smelled like stale coffee and CA pet cleaner. I got there 20 minutes early. I wanted to see the space before he arrived. I wanted to feel it under my feet. I wanted to know where I'd be sitting and where he'd be sitting and where the door was. Margaret walked in behind me. She put her briefcase on the table. She said, You look ready. I said, I am. She said, Good. Remember, you don't have to agree to anything today. This is just a conversation. You can walk out at any time. I said, I know. She said, And Elena. You're not the one who should be nervous. Michael walked in at exactly 10. His attorney was with him, a man in a gray suit who looked like he'd done this 1,000 times. Michael looked like he hadn't slept in a month. He looked smaller than I remembered. He looked like someone had taken something out of him. I felt a flicker of something. Not pity. Not sympathy. Just recognition. He sat across from me. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. I looked back. The mediator was a woman named Barbara. She was calm and efficient. She explained the process. She said we were here to try to reach an agreement without going to court. She said we'd talk about assets. She said we'd talk about the house. She said we'd talk about the future. She said, "Is everyone ready?" I said, "Yes." Michael said, "Yes. We sta root with the house." Marga rep presented my proposal. I wanted to keep it. I wanted to buy him out. I had the numbers. I had the financing. I'd already spoken to a lender. I was ready to make it happen. Michael's attorney said they'd have to review the numbers. Michael didn't say anything. We moved to the investments. I wanted half. I wanted the retirement accounts split evenly. I wanted the pension divided. I wanted everything we'd built together, split down the middle. Michael's attorney said they'd have to review the numbers. Michael didn't say anything. We moved to the debt. The credit cards. The CAR payments. I wanted to split it evenly. I wanted to be responsible for my half. I didn't want to be responsible for his. Michael's attorney said they'd have to review the numbers. Michael didn't say anything. Barbara looked at Michael. She said, "Michael, do you have anything to say?" He looked at me. He said, "I want to talk to her alone." I said, "No." He said, "Please. Just for a few minutes." I looked at Marga Red. She shrugged. She said, "It's up to you." I said, "Fine." 5 minutes. Everyone left. The room was quiet. I sat across from him. He sat across from me. We looked at each other. He said, "I don't want this." I said, "I know." He said, "I want to fix it. I want to go to counseling. I want to try." I said, "Michael, I don't want to try." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm tired. I'm so tired. I'm tired of being the one who fixes everything. I'm tired of being the one who tries. I'm tired of being the one who waits. I waited for 19 years. I waited for you to see me. I waited for you to choose me. I waited for you to treat me like a person. And you never did. Not once." He said, "That's not true." I said, "It is true. You pushed me a check at our anniversary dinner. You pushed me a check and you told me to handle it. You treated me like I was your secretary. You treated me like I was there to serve you. And you did it in front of everyone. You did it in front of Rhonda. You did it in front of the piano player. You did it in front of everyone." And I sat there and I smiled. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know you're sorry. You've been sorry for weeks. But sorry doesn't fix anything. Sorry doesn't unspend the money. Sorry doesn't unsleep with Claire. Sorry doesn't unpush that check across the table. Sorry is just a word. And I'm tired of words." He said, "What do you want from me?" I said, "I want you to sign the papers. I want you to give me what I'm asking for. I want you to let me go." He said, "I can't do that." I said, "You can. You just don't want to." He said, "Elena, I built my life around you. I don't know who I am without you." I said, "That's the problem. You built your life around me. I built my life around us. And I'm the one who has to figure out who I am. Not you. Me. You don't get to make this about you." He said, "I'm not making it about me." I said, "You're making it about your guilt and your fear and your loneliness. You're making it about what you're losing. You're not thinking about what I'm losing. You're not thinking about what I've already lost." He said, "What have you lost?" I said, "Everything. My trust. My time. My sense of self. I lost everything. And I'm not going to get it back by staying with you." He was quiet. He looked at the table. He said, "Is there anything I can say?" I said, "No." He said, "Is there anything I can do?" I said, "Yes. Sign the papers. Let me go. And don't make this harder than it has to be." He nodded. He said, "Okay." He looked at me. He said, "I loved you. I really did." I said, "I know you did. But love isn't enough. It never was." I stood up. I walked to the door. I opened it. I said, "I'll be in the hall. When you're ready to sign, I'll come back in." I walked out. I stood in the hallway. Marga Ret was there. She looked at me. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm not okay. But I'm going to be." She said, "He's going to sign. I can see it in his face." I said, "I know." We went back in. Barbara was there. Michael's attorney was there. Michael was sitting at the table. He had a pen in his hand. He looked at me. He said, I'll sign. He signed the papers. He signed them all. He signed away the house. He signed away half the investments. He signed away the retirement accounts. He signed away everything. I watched him do it. I watched him write his name. I watched him hand the papers to Barbara. I watched him put the pen down. I watched him look at me. He said, it's done. I said, thank you. He said, is that all? I said, that's all. He stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned around. He said, I really am sorry. I said, I know. He said, I hope you find what you're looking for. I said, I already have. He left. I sat down. I looked at the papers. I looked at his signature. I looked at my name. I looked at everything. I didn't feel anything. I was too tired to feel anything. Margaret said, Elena, you did it. I said, I did it. She said, what now? I said, now I go home. She said, to your apartment? I said, yes. To my apartment. To my life. She nodded. She packed her briefcase. She said, I'll file the final papers. It'll be official in a few weeks. I said, thank you. She said, you did the hard part. I said, I know. I walked out of the building. I walked to my car. I sat there for a long time. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there. I watched people walk past. I watched the sun move across the sky. I watched a bird land on the roof of the building. I thought about Michael. I thought about Claire. I thought about the check. I thought about the blue dress. I thought about the restaurant. I thought about Rhonda. I thought about the piano playing something sad. I thought about Sophie. I thought about my apartment. I thought about my plant. I thought about my desk. I thought about my life. I rude the car. I drove home. I drove to my apartment. I parked. I walked up the stairs. I opened the door. I walked in. I looked around. It was quiet. It was small. It was mine. I sat on the floor. I sat in the middle of the room. I looked at the walls. I looked at the windows. I looked at the plant on the sill. I looked at everything. I said out loud, I'm home. I didn't cry. I still couldn't. But I felt something. Something that wasn't anger or sadness or relief. It was quiet. It was still. It was like a door closing and a window opening. I called Sophie. I told her it was done. She said, are you okay? I said, I'm okay. She said, do you want me to come over? I said, no. I need to be alone right now. She said, I'll be here if you need me. I said, I know. I hung up. I sat on the floor. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the check. I thought about the $1,247. I thought about the Venmo request. I thought about the memo. I thought about the $17,000. I thought about everything I'd done. I thought about how far I'd come. I thought about how much I'd changed. I thought about how I'd root as the woman who paid the check and ended as the woman who walked out. I thought about Margaret. I thought about Sophie. I thought about Claire. I thought about Michael. I thought about all of them. I didn't know what was next. But I knew I was going to be fine. I knew I was going to figure it out. I knew I was going to keep moving four-way road. I knew I was going to keep building. I stood up. I walked to my desk. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I root working on a new project. I worked for hours. I worked until I couldn't see straight. I worked until I was too tired to think. I closed my laptop. I stood up. I walked to the bedroom. I lay down. I closed my eyes. I thought about the blue dress. I thought about Rhonda's name tag. I thought about the piano. I fell asleep. I didn't dream. I woke up the next morning and I felt something. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't peace. It was something else. It was the feeling of being done. I got up. I made coffee. I sat at my desk. I looked at my plant. I looked at my apartment. I looked at everything. I said out loud, this is my life. I said it again. This is my life. I didn't know what it was going to look like. I didn't know where it was going to go. But I knew it was mine. And that was enough. The paperwork came through on a Tuesday. I was at my desk working on a new logo for a boutique hotel when my phone buzzed. Margaret's name. I picked it up. She said, "It's done. The judge signed this morning. You're officially divorced." I said, "Okay." She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I don't know yet. I'll let you know." She laughed. She said, "You're going to be fine, Elena." I said, "I know." I hung up. I looked at my laptop. I looked at the logo I was designing. I looked at the plan on the windowsill. I looked at the balcony. I looked at the street below. I didn't feel different. I felt the same. I felt like me. I went back to work. I finished the logo. I sent it to the client. I invoiced them. I made lunch. I ate it. I did the dishes. I went for a walk. I came back. I sat on the balcony. I watched the sun go down. It was a Tuesday. It was just a Tuesday. Sophie called that night. She said, it's official." I said, "It is." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm fine. I'm better than fine." She said, "You want to have dinner this weekend?" I said, "I'd love to." She said, "Your place or mine?" I said, "Mine." "I'll see Kay." She said, "You never see Kay." I said, "I'm learning." She laughed. She said, "I'll be there Saturday." We hung up. I sat in my apartment. I looked at the walls. I looked at the furniture. I looked at everything. It was mine. All of it. I'd bought it with my own money. I'd picked it out myself. I'd chosen every single thing. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I thought about Michael. I hadn't seen him since the mediation. I hadn't talked to him. I hadn't wanted to. The divorce was final now. There was no reason to talk anymore. He wasn't my husband anymore. He was just someone I used to know. I thought about Claire. I hadn't talked to her either. I didn't need to. She wasn't the problem. She never was. She was just a symptom. She was just a sign. She was just a woman who was lonely and made a mistake. I understood that now. I understood it completely. I thought about the check. I thought about the restaurant. I thought about Rhonda. I thought about the blue dress. I thought about the piano. I thought about everything. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel sad. I just felt done. I felt like I'd finished something. I felt like I'd closed a chapter. I felt like I was ready for the next one. Saturday came. Sophie arrived at 6. She brought wine. She brought flowers. She brought a dessert from a bakery she liked. She looked at my apartment. She said, "It looks good." I said, "It's coming together." She said, "You really did it." I said, "I really did." She said, "You're like a whole different person." I said, "I'm not different. I'm just the person I was supposed to be all along." She hugged me. She said, "I'm proud of you." I said, "I'm proud of me too." We had dinner. I made pasta. It wasn't as good as Michael's, but I made it. I served it. We ate it. We talked about her work. We talked about her plans. We talked about her friends. We talked about normal things. We talked like we were just two people having dinner. We were. That was the thing. We were just two people. After dinner, Sophie left. I did the dishes. I put them away. I wiped the counter. I turned off the light. I sat on the balcony. I watched the street. I watched the cars. I watched the people. I thought about my life. I thought about what came next. I didn't know. I didn't have a plan. I'd spent so long planning for the divorce that I hadn't planned for after. I'd thought about what I was leaving. I hadn't thought about what I was going Tower Road. I thought about that. I thought about what I wanted. I thought about who I wanted to be. I thought about what I wanted to do. I thought about everything. I didn't have answers. But I had time. I had time to figure it out. I had time to grow. I had time to become. I had time to be. I went to bed. I slept well. I woke up the next morning and I felt something. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear. It was just a feeling. A feeling of possibility. I got up. I made coffee. I sat at my desk. I opened my laptop. I looked at my email. I looked at my calendar. I looked at my life. I had a meeting with a new client that afternoon. A woman who was rooting her own business. She wanted a brand. She wanted a logo. She wanted something that represented her. I was going to help her. I was going to help her build something. I thought about that. I thought about building things. I thought about STA rooting over. I thought about the future. I thought about everything. I went to the meeting. It went well. The client hired me. I came home. I sat on the balcony. I watched the sun go down. I thought about the day. I thought about the week. I thought about the month. I thought about the year. I thought about everything. I didn't think about Michael. I didn't think about Claire. I didn't think about the check. I didn't think about the restaurant. I didn't think about any of it. I was done. I was finally done. A week later, I got a text from Michael. It was the first time he'd contacted me since the mediation. It said, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I hope you're happy." I looked at the text. I looked at his name. I looked at the words. I thought about what to say. I typed, "I am happy. I hope you are too." I sent it. I put the phone down. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't need one. I thought about what he'd said. I hope you're happy. I thought about whether I was happy. I thought about what happiness meant. I thought about whether I'd found it. I didn't know if I was happy, but I was content. I was peaceful. I was at ease. I was free. I thought about the check. I thought about the $1,247. I thought about the Venmo request. I thought about the memo. I thought about everything I'd done. I thought about everything I'd become. I wasn't the same person who'd sat in that restaurant. I wasn't the same person who'd smiled at Rhonda. I wasn't the same person who'd paid the check. I was someone else. Someone stronger. Someone more certain. Someone who knew what she was worth. I sat on the balcony. I looked at the sky. I looked at the stars. I looked at the city. I looked at everything. I thought about the future. I thought about all the things I was going to do. I thought about all the things I was going to become. I thought about all the things I was going to build. I thought about Sophie. I thought about my plant. I thought about my APA retirement. I thought about my life. I said out loud, "I'm worth more than that check." I said it again. "I'm worth more than that check." I said it a third time. "I'm worth more than that check." I believed it. I finally believed it. I went inside. I closed the balcony door. I walked to my desk. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I STA working on a new project. I worked until I was tired. I closed my laptop. I went to bed. I slept well. I woke up the next morning and I did it again. And again. And again. That was my life now. It was simple. It was quiet. It was mine. And I was going to live it. Every single day. For the rest of my life.